There's nothing quite like being the town fool, especially when you've lived long enough to remember when folks actually respected your name. Old Caleb Boone knew that feeling all too well when the people of Dry River laughed behind his back for trading his last good land for a cave that seemed worth nothing. The mountain man said it felt right, though nobody understood what he meant. With his faithful dog Rufus, Caleb disappeared into the mountains while everyone shook their heads. But when Rufus started digging at the cave's back wall, he uncovered something nobody expected. What lay hidden behind that stone would change everything Caleb thought he knew about his life. But would this discovery finally give him back his dignity, or would it cost him everything he had left? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Granite Hollow as Caleb Boone adjusted the worn leather collar around Rufus's neck. The collar bore a name etched in faded letters: Martha, a reminder of better days when love filled this old man's world. Rufus, a mixed-breed hound with intelligent amber eyes and graying fur around his muzzle, had been Martha's dog first, back when she still drew breath and laughter echoed through their ranch house. Caleb ran his weathered fingers along the collar's edge, remembering how Martha had insisted on having her name engraved there instead of Caleb's. "If he gets lost," she'd said with that gentle smile of hers, "folks will know he belongs to someone who loves him proper." That was Martha's way, always thinking of others, even when it came to a dog's collar. The cave entrance yawned before them, like a mouth carved into the mountainside, its rocky lips holding secrets that the town of Dry River couldn't begin to imagine. 3 months had passed since Caleb made what everyone considered the worst trade in the county's history. His 40 acres of decent grazing land, the last piece of property that connected him to respectability, for this hollow inn, the rock that most folks wouldn't use to shelter cattle from a storm. But Caleb had felt something the day he first laid eyes on the cave. Standing there in the afternoon light, with the wind carrying the scent of pine and old stone, he'd experienced a sensation he hadn't felt since Martha passed. A sense of rightness, of being exactly where he needed to be. The real estate agent, a slick young man from the county seat, had tried to talk him out of it, even offered to sweeten the deal with cash on top, thinking the old mountain man had finally lost his grip on reality. Maybe he had. The townspeople certainly thought so. Dry River wasn't the same place it had been when Caleb and Martha first settled there 43 years ago. Back then, it was a community where neighbors helped neighbors, where a man's word meant something, and where respect was earned through honest work and faithful living. Caleb had been somebody then, a successful rancher whose cattle brought top dollar, whose opinion carried weight at town meetings, whose handshake sealed deals worth thousands. Martha had been the heart of their home, a woman whose kitchen always smelled of fresh bread and whose garden produced vegetables that she shared freely with anyone who needed them. She taught Sunday school at the Little White Church on Elm Street and organized the annual Harvest Festival that brought families together from 3 counties over. When she spoke, people listened. When she laughed, others couldn't help but smile. Along, the change had begun slowly, like rust creeping across metal. Younger families moved in, bringing different ideas about community and progress. The old families, the ones who remembered the town's founding and respected its traditions, began moving away or passing on. New businesses opened, chain stores and fast food restaurants that drew customers away from the family-owned establishments that had served the town for generations. Then Martha got sick. Cancer, the doctor said, the kind that moved fast and showed no mercy. Caleb spent their savings fighting it, driving her to specialists in Denver, trying experimental treatments that promised hope but delivered only debt. He mortgaged the ranch, sold his prize breeding stock, liquidated everything of value. For 18 months he fought alongside his wife, believing that love and determination could conquer anything. When Martha died on a Tuesday morning in October, With autumn light streaming through the hospital window and her hand growing cold in his, something fundamental broke inside Caleb Boone. Not just his heart, though that shattered completely, but his connection to the world around him. The community that had once embraced them both suddenly seemed distant and foreign. The medical bills consumed what remained of his assets. The ranch went to the bank, along with most of his cattle and equipment. Friends who had enjoyed Martha's hospitality and his companionship found reasons to avoid him, as if his misfortune might be contagious. The new pastor at the church, a young seminary graduate who had never known Martha, offered platitudes about God's plan that felt empty and hollow. Within 2 years, Caleb Boone went from being one of Dry River's most respected citizens to being the old man who lived in a trailer on the edge of town, scraping by on Social Security and odd jobs. People who had once sought his advice now looked through him as if he'd become invisible. Children whispered stories about the crazy hermit who talked to his dog and walked the mountain trails at all hours. The final blow came when Buck Morrison arrived in town. Morrison was everything the new Dry River seemed to value. Young, ambitious, and flush with development money. He bought up properties with cash offers, talked about bringing progress and prosperity to the area, and made friends with the mayor and town council faster than a snake could strike. His plans for a luxury resort and golf course sounded impressive to people who had grown tired of their sleepy mountain community. When Morrison offered to buy Caleb's remaining 40 acres for 3 times its assessed value, everyone expected the old man to jump at the chance. The land wasn't particularly valuable. Rocky terrain better suited for grazing than farming, with a seasonal creek that ran dry most summers. But it was all Caleb had left, the last piece of property that bore his name on a deed. Instead of selling to Morrison, Caleb shocked everyone by trading the land to a private owner for the cave in Granite Hollow. No cash changed hands, just deeds and signatures. The other party, an elderly widow from California who had inherited the cave from her great-uncle, was happy to trade it for usable land. She never asked why Caleb wanted a hole in the mountain, and Caleb never offered to explain. The town's reaction was swift and merciless. At Murphy's Diner, where the morning coffee crowd gathered to discuss local affairs, Caleb became the subject of head-shaking conversations about senility and poor judgment. Hardware store owner Jim Henley told anyone who would listen that he'd seen this kind of thing before, old folks making crazy decisions when grief finally caught up with them. Even Dr. Patricia Wells, who had known Caleb and Martha for 20 years, suggested gently that he might benefit from having someone help him manage his affairs. The implications stung worse than the words themselves. They thought he was incompetent, a danger to himself, someone who needed protection from his own decisions. But here in Granite Hollow, with Rufus pressed against his leg and the morning air, crisp with the promise of autumn, Caleb felt more clear-headed than he had in years. The cave stretched back into the mountainside farther than his flashlight could penetrate, its walls carved by water and time into smooth curves that caught and held sound. During their first week here, he'd discovered that the cave stayed a constant 58 degrees year-round, making it comfortable even on the hottest summer days. More importantly, he'd found peace in its silence. Away from the whispers and sideways glances of town, away from the constant reminders of what he'd lost and who he used to be, Caleb could simply exist. He'd set up a simple camp near the entrance. A sleeping bag, a small propane stove, some basic supplies. Rufus seemed content with the arrangement, spending his days exploring the surrounding woods and his evenings lying by Caleb's side as they watched the stars emerge over the mountain peaks. The cave itself held mysteries that grew, more intriguing the longer Caleb studied them. The main chamber was large enough to park a truck in, with several passages branching off into the mountain's depths. Some of these passages were natural, carved by underground streams, but others showed signs of human work. Tool marks on the walls, Carefully placed support timbers, the remains of old lantern brackets. Caleb had grown up hearing stories about the area's mining history. His grandfather, one of the original settlers, used to tell tales of prospectors who came through in the late 1800s, following rumors of gold deposits in the surrounding mountains. Most found nothing but worthless rock and broken dreams. A few struck it rich and moved on to easier diggings, and some, according to local legend, simply disappeared. The McAllister family was part of that legend. Thomas McAllister had claimed a section of Granite Hollow back in 1889, bringing his wife and 2 young children from Colorado to work a mine he was certain would make them wealthy. For a few months, they'd been regular visitors to Dry River, buying supplies and sharing stories of promising ore samples. Then, one autumn day, they simply vanished. Their camp was found abandoned, their equipment left behind, their fate unknown. Some said they'd moved on to better prospects in California. Others whispered about claim jumpers and violence, about bodies hidden in mine shafts and secrets buried with the dead. The truth, like so many truths from that era, had been lost to time and the fading memories of old-timers who took their stories to unmarked graves. As Caleb explored his cave over the past 3 months, he'd begun to wonder if Thomas McAllister's mine might be connected to his new home. The tool marks and support timbers suggested serious excavation work, and the cave's location matched descriptions he'd heard of the McAllister claim. But without concrete evidence, it remained just another mountain legend, interesting but unprovable. What mattered more was the sense of purpose he felt here. For the first time since Martha's death, Caleb woke each morning with something to look forward to. He had projects, mapping the cave's passages, identifying the different types of rock, formations, cataloging the wildlife that used the cave for shelter. Simple work, but satisfying in a way that reminded him of the methodical care he'd once brought to ranching. Rufus had adapted to their new life with the resilience that dogs seemed to possess naturally. The hound explored every corner of their domain, marking territory and establishing routines that gave structure to their days. He'd appointed himself guardian of the cave entrance, barking at strangers but welcoming the occasional deer or elk that wandered through their hollow. Tati. Dog's presence was more than companionship. It was connection to Martha's memory and proof that love could outlast loss. When Caleb talked to Rufus, which he did frequently, he felt less alone in the world. When the dog pressed against his leg during cold mountain nights, warmth flowed between them that went deeper than shared body heat. Now, as autumn painted the aspen trees in shades of gold and the morning air carried the promise of winter, Caleb felt grateful for the choices that had brought them to this place. The townspeople might think him foolish, but their opinions mattered less with each passing day. He had shelter, solitude, and the kind of peace that money couldn't buy. He had no way of knowing that Rufus, with his keen senses and boundless curiosity, was about to change everything. The first sign that something extraordinary was about to unfold came on a Thursday morning when Rufus refused his breakfast. Caleb had prepared the dog's usual meal, canned food mixed with dry kibble, and set it in the familiar spot near the cave entrance where they ate together each day. But instead of diving into his food with his customary enthusiasm, Rufus sat motionless, his amber eyes fixed on something deeper in the cave that Caleb couldn't see. "What's got into you, old friend?" Caleb asked, following the dog's intense gaze into the shadows beyond their makeshift camp. "You sick? You never turn down food." But Rufus wasn't sick. His nose twitched with interest, his ears perked forward with an alertness that spoke of discovery rather than illness. The dog stood and walked purposefully toward the back of the main chamber, where the cave narrowed into several smaller passages. Caleb had explored these passages during his first weeks here, finding nothing but solid rock walls and the occasional bat roost. Rufus stopped at the entrance to the leftmost passage, the one Caleb had dismissed as too narrow and unstable to investigate thoroughly. The dog began pawing at the base of the wall, his claws scraping against loose stones with a persistence that caught Caleb's attention. This wasn't random behavior. Rufus was focused on something specific, something that had triggered every hunting instinct in his aging body. "What you found there, boy?" Caleb approached with his flashlight, kneeling beside the dog, despite the protest from his arthritic knees. "Probably just a pack rat or some such." But as the beam of his flashlight illuminated the spot where Rufus was digging, Caleb felt his breath catch in his throat. The stones weren't naturally placed. Someone had carefully fitted them together, creating what appeared to be a deliberate wall rather than a random rockfall. And between the stones, where Rufus's claws had dislodged some of the smaller pieces, cool air flowed with a steady current that suggested open space beyond. Caleb's pulse quickened as he examined the stonework more closely. The craftsmanship was crude but purposeful, the work of someone who knew enough about mining to create a proper seal, but who had worked quickly, perhaps under pressure. Some of the stones bore tool marks, evidence of hasty chiseling to make them fit together properly. Martha's voice echoed in his memory, warm with the enthusiasm she'd brought to local history. She'd spent hours in the county library, researching the stories of early settlers and the mining boom that had briefly transformed their quiet valley into a scene of frantic activity. "The McAllister family just vanished," she'd told him one evening, looking up from a collection of old newspaper clippings. Thomas McAllister filed claims on 3 different sites, but only worked one seriously. The others, he said, were for future development. Then they all disappeared, and nobody ever found out what happened to their main mine. Could this sealed passage be connected to that old mystery? Caleb had dismissed such thoughts as wishful thinking, but the evidence before him suggested otherwise. The location matched the general area described in the old stories, and the craftsmanship looked consistent with 1880s mining techniques. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew Martha's wedding ring. He'd carried it with him every day since her funeral, a simple gold band that represented 41 years of shared dreams and mutual devotion. In moments of uncertainty, touching the ring helped him feel connected to her wisdom and strength. Martha would have told him to investigate. She'd always been the curious one, the person who couldn't resist a mystery or an opportunity to uncover hidden truths. "Life's too short for wondering what if," she used to say. "If something calls to you, you owe it to yourself to find out why." Rufus continued pawing at the stones, his determination unwavering. The dog had found something significant. Caleb felt certain of that now. But removing the stones would require careful work, and at 74 years old he wasn't sure his body could handle the physical demands of excavation. Still, the possibility of discovery filled him with an energy he hadn't felt in years. If this passage led to something important, maybe even the lost McAllister mine, it could change everything. Not just his financial situation, though that would certainly matter, but his standing in a community that had written him off as a foolish old man. Over the next 3 days, Caleb worked methodically to remove the stone barrier. He started with the smallest pieces, testing the stability of the wall before attempting anything that might cause a dangerous collapse. Rufus supervised the work, occasionally nosing aside rocks that Caleb had loosened but maintaining his vigil. At the site, by Saturday afternoon, Caleb had created an opening large enough to squeeze through. The passage beyond was narrow but navigable, carved from living rock with the same mixture of natural formation and human modification he'd observed in the main chamber. His flashlight beam revealed wooden support beams, still solid after more than a century, and the scattered remains of mining equipment. 20 feet into the passage, Caleb found the first piece of concrete evidence that this was indeed a working mine. An old pickaxe lay against the wall where someone had dropped it, its wooden handle weathered but intact. Nearby, a canvas bag contained samples of quartz shot through with threads of gold that glittered in the flashlight beam. His heart pounded as he examined the samples. Even his untrained eye could see that the gold content was substantial. Not just traces or fool's gold, but genuine precious metal in concentrations that would have excited any 19th century prospector. If the mine contained ore like this, in meaningful quantities, it represented wealth beyond anything Caleb had dared imagine. But the excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. Why had the passage been sealed so carefully? And why had the miners abandoned such valuable equipment and samples? The scene suggested hasty departure, as if the workers had left suddenly and never returned. Deeper investigation revealed more disturbing evidence. A leather satchel contained personal items, a pocket watch, a small Bible, a daguerreotype of a woman and 2 children that had to be the McAllister family. These weren't items a miner would leave behind voluntarily. They suggested tragedy, possibly violence. Caleb sat back on his heels, Martha's ring warm in his palm, as he contemplated the implications of his discovery. The McAllister mine was real, and it was located on his property, but the circumstances surrounding its abandonment raised questions that made him hesitate to celebrate. Martha had always said that every treasure came with a price. Looking at the evidence before him, the hasty concealment, the abandoned personal belongings, the valuable ore samples left behind, Caleb began to understand that some prices might be higher than others. Rufus pressed against his leg, offering comfort and companionship in the flickering shadows of the abandoned mine. The dog's loyalty reminded Caleb that he wasn't facing this mystery alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever decisions needed to be made, he had at least one ally whose devotion was absolute. As they made their way back through the passage toward the main chamber, Caleb's mind raced with possibilities and concerns. The discovery would change his life, that much was certain, but whether those changes would bring the redemption he'd hoped for or complications he couldn't handle remained to be seen. The wedding ring in his pocket seemed to pulse with Martha's gentle wisdom. Sometimes the most important discoveries aren't the ones we go looking for, but the ones that find us when we're ready to see them. Ready or not, Caleb Boone was about to learn that some secrets, once uncovered, couldn't be buried. Again, the old mining lantern sat on Caleb's camp table like a messenger from the past, its brass surface tarnished, but its glass chimney miraculously intact after decades of abandonment. He'd found it hanging from a wooden peg driven into the passage wall, positioned as if someone had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to return. When Caleb cleaned the soot from its wick and filled it with kerosene from his camp supplies, the lantern blazed to life with a steady, warm glow that transformed the cave's harsh shadows into dancing patterns of light and darkness. Something about that flame, perhaps its resemblance to the oil lamps Martha had loved in their early years together, filled him with a sense of continuity, of connection to the miners who had worked these tunnels more than a century ago. Rufus seemed to approve of the lantern as well. The dog had claimed a position near the passage entrance, alert but relaxed, as if he understood that his role as discoverer had evolved into that of guardian. Whenever Caleb ventured deeper into the mine, Rufus followed at a respectful distance, his presence both companionship and protection. The passage extended much farther than Caleb had initially realized. Beyond the spot where he'd found the lantern, the tunnel opened into a series of chambers that showed clear evidence of systematic excavation. Support timbers had been carefully placed to prevent cave-ins, and side passages branched off at regular intervals, suggesting that the miners had been following specific ore veins rather than digging randomly. In the largest of these chambers, Caleb discovered what had once been a primitive but functional mine office. A wooden desk, warped but still standing, held the remnants of record books and correspondence. Most of the papers had deteriorated beyond reading, but a few pages remained legible enough to provide glimpses into Thomas McAllister's operation. The mine had been more successful than the old stories suggested. According to the fragmentary records, McAllister had extracted significant amounts of high-grade ore during the 8 months he worked the site. His letters to suppliers mentioned orders for equipment that suggested expansion plans, and his personal notes revealed growing excitement about the mine's potential. But alongside the evidence of success, Caleb found hints of trouble. A letter, dated October 1889, just weeks before the McAllister family's disappearance, mentioned unwelcome visitors and concerns about claim jumpers. Another fragmentary note referred to watching the camp and keeping the rifle loaded. The physical evidence supported these concerns about security. Near the office area, Caleb found a hidden alcove carved into the rock wall, large enough to conceal valuable ore samples or important documents. The alcove was empty now, but scratches around its opening suggested frequent use, as if someone had regularly hidden and retrieved materials. More disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be defensive preparations. In several locations throughout the mine, Caleb found evidence that the passages had been prepared for quick sealing. Piles of stones positioned for rapid deployment, wooden barriers that could be dropped across tunnel entrances, even what looked like the remains of a primitive alarm system using string and small bells. The picture that emerged was of a successful mining operation that had become increasingly paranoid about outside threats. Thomas McAllister hadn't just been extracting gold, he'd been preparing for war. As Caleb explored deeper into the mine complex, his respect for the physical demands of the work grew alongside his concern about his own limitations. The passages were narrow, requiring frequent crawling and squeezing through tight spaces that challenged his arthritic joints and aging muscles. His breathing came harder in the thin air, and he found himself taking frequent rest breaks that a younger man wouldn't have needed. But the excitement of discovery drove him forward. Each chamber revealed new evidence of the mine's extent and value. In one area, he found stockpiles of high-grade ore that McAllister had apparently been saving for transport to the nearest assay office. In another, he discovered the remains of a primitive smelting operation, complete with crucibles and molds for creating gold ingots. The most significant discovery came in what appeared to be the mine's deepest working area. Here, the walls showed evidence of a rich vein that had been systematically extracted, leaving behind cavities lined with quartz formations that still contained visible gold deposits. Even with his limited knowledge of geology, Caleb could see that this vein continued deeper into the mountain, suggesting that McAllister had barely begun to exploit the site's full potential. But it was in this deepest chamber that Caleb found the most troubling evidence of the mine's abrupt abandonment. Tools lay scattered as if dropped in haste, picks and shovels left where they'd fallen, ore carts abandoned mid-load, candles burned down to pools of hardened wax. The scene suggested that the miners had left suddenly, possibly in response to immediate danger. Rufus's behavior in this area reinforced Caleb's growing unease. The usually confident dog became nervous and clingy, pressing close to Caleb's legs and occasionally whimpering at shadows that seemed empty to human eyes. Whatever had happened here had left traces that Rufus's keen senses could still detect. The physical toll of exploration was becoming apparent. By the end of each day, Caleb's joints ached from crawling through narrow passages, and his back protested against the constant bending and lifting required to examine the mine's contents. His flashlight batteries were depleting faster than he'd anticipated, and he realized he would need to make a trip to town for supplies soon. That prospect filled him with mixed emotions. He needed materials, fresh batteries, more kerosene for the lantern, perhaps some basic tools to help with excavation. But visiting Dry River meant facing the curious questions and sideways glances of townspeople who had already written him. Off as eccentric, how could he explain his sudden need for mining supplies without revealing his discovery? The question of secrecy weighed heavily on his mind. Part of him wanted to share the excitement of his find, to prove to the community that his trade hadn't been the act of a senile old fool. But Martha's voice in his memory counseled caution. Some things are too precious to share until you understand what they really mean. she'd said once, discussing a family secret that had remained hidden for decades. The McAllister mine was certainly precious, but its true meaning remained elusive. The evidence of sudden abandonment, the defensive preparations, the personal belongings left behind, all suggested a story more complex and dangerous than simple mining success. As Caleb sat in the main chamber that evening, the old lantern casting its warm glow across the cave walls, he made a decision. He would continue exploring, continue learning about the mine and its history. But he would do so carefully, quietly, until he understood not just what Thomas McAllister had found, but what had cost the man his life. Rufus settled beside him, the dog's steady presence a reminder that some loyalties transcended time and circumstance. Whatever secrets the mine held, whatever dangers it might represent, Caleb wouldn't face them alone. The lantern that had guided miners more than a century ago would light his path forward, and Rufus would guard his back. The McAllister family portrait stared back at Caleb through the cracked glass of its frame, their faces frozen in the formal poses that 19th-century photography demanded. Thomas McAllister stood behind his seated wife, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, while two young children, a boy and a girl, flanked their mother with the solemn expressions that children of that era wore for cameras. Caleb had bound the portrait in what appeared to be the mine's main office area, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in a metal box that had protected it from moisture and decay. The preservation was remarkable. The faces clear enough that he could see Thomas McAllister's determined jaw and his wife's gentle eyes, features that spoke of people who had faced hardship with dignity and hope. But it was what he'd discovered alongside the portrait that truly captured his attention. The metal box contained documents that told the story of the McAllister family's final weeks in Granite Hollow, and that story was darker than the local legends had suggested. Thomas McAllister's journal, written in careful script on pages that had yellowed but remained readable, revealed a man growing increasingly desperate. The entries began with optimism about the mine's potential and excitement about the future he was building for his family. But as weeks passed, the tone shifted to concern, then fear, then barely controlled panic. October 12th, 1889, strangers watching the camp again today. Sarah spotted them on the ridge while hanging laundry. Same three men as before, but closer this time. They made no effort to hide themselves. October 18th, found evidence someone had been through our supplies while we were working the mine. Nothing taken, but everything disturbed. Sarah wants to leave. Can't blame her, but we're so close to something big. October 25th. Sheriff Bradley came by today. Says he's heard reports of trouble with claim jumpers in the area. Offered to post a man here for protection, but something about his manner didn't sit right. Sarah says I'm being paranoid. Maybe so, but better safe than sorry. The final entries painted a picture of a family under siege, trapped between the valuable mine they'd worked so hard to develop and the growing threats from people who wanted to take it from them. November 3rd, they came in the night, 3 men, maybe 4. Sarah heard them first, woke me from sleep. By the time I got the rifle, they were already at the mine entrance, shouted that they knew about the gold, demanded we turn over the claim. Papers, told them to clear out or face the consequences. November 5th, can't stay much longer. Sarah's right, the children are frightened, and I don't know how to protect them here. But if we leave, we lose everything. All these months of work, all the gold still in the ground. How do I choose between my family's safety and their future? The journal ended there, but other documents in the box filled in more details. Letters from suppliers showed that Thomas had been preparing to expand his operation significantly. Orders for additional equipment, requests for assay services, inquiries about shipping arrangements for large quantities of ore. All suggested a man who believed he was on the verge of substantial wealth. More disturbing were the legal documents. Thomas had filed claims on 3 different sites in the area, but only one, the site where Caleb now stood, had been worked seriously. The other claims appeared to be defensive, filed to prevent competitors from establishing operations too close to his main mine. But someone had challenged those claims. Legal papers showed that a group of investors from Denver had disputed Thomas's filings claiming prior rights to the area. The investors were represented by a law firm with offices in Denver and Colorado Springs, and their challenge was supported by testimony from local residents who claimed Thomas had jumped their claims. Reading between the lines, Caleb began to understand what had happened. The McAllister family hadn't simply disappeared. They'd been driven away by a coordinated effort to steal their mine. The legal challenges were cover for what amounted to theft. And when Thomas refused to abandon his legitimate claim, the situation had escalated to threats and violence. The evidence suggested that local officials might have been involved. Sheriff Bradley's visit, described in Thomas's journal with such suspicion, took on sinister implications when Caleb found a letter among the documents. The letter, written by one of the Denver investors, mentioned arrangements with local authorities and cooperation from the sheriff's office. Corruption, claim jumping and murder. The McAllister family had stumbled into a conspiracy that stretched from the local level to Denver's business community. Their crime had been finding gold in a place where powerful people wanted to control the mineral rights. As Caleb sat in the mine office, surrounded by the evidence of this 19th-century crime, he began to understand that his own situation might not be as different as he'd hoped. If the mine truly contained the wealth that Thomas McAllister had believed it did, then word of its rediscovery would inevitably spread. And when it did, the same forces that had destroyed one family might turn their attention to an aging mountain man with no allies and no protection. The thought was sobering, but also strangely liberating. For months, Caleb had felt like a victim of circumstances beyond his control: age, poverty, social isolation, the community's casual dismissal of his worth. But the McAllister story reminded him that some fights were worth having, even when the odds seemed impossible. Thomas McAllister had been a younger man with a family to protect, facing organized opposition with significant resources. Caleb was older, alone except for Rufus, but he also had advantages that Thomas hadn't possessed. He owned the property legally, without the complicated claim system that had made Thomas vulnerable. He had no family to threaten, which paradoxically made him harder to intimidate. And he had nothing left to lose except his dignity, something that had already been stripped away by the community's judgment. Looking at the portrait again, Caleb felt a kinship with the long-dead miner. Thomas McAllister had been a man trying to build something better for his family, willing to face danger for the promise of a secure future. Caleb was a man trying to reclaim something that had been taken from him: respect, purpose, the feeling that his life still mattered. The gold in the mine represented more than wealth. It represented vindication, proof that his instincts about the cave had been correct, validation that he wasn't the foolish old man everyone believed him to be. But as he carefully rewrapped the portrait and returned it to its protective box, Caleb understood that vindication would come with a price. The same greed and corruption that had destroyed the McAllister family still existed, wearing different faces, but driven by the same ruthless hunger for wealth and power. The question wasn't whether he would face opposition, it was whether he would be ready for it when it came. Martha's recipe box sat on the small table in Caleb's trailer, its wooden surface worn smooth by decades of use. He'd retrieved it from storage that morning, drawn by a memory of something Martha had once mentioned about local history. The box contained more than just her carefully written recipes for apple pie and Sunday pot roast. Tucked between the index cards were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and fragments of stories she'd collected during her years of researching. Dry rivers passed. Gold fever never really left these mountains, Martha had told him once, looking up from a yellowed newspaper article. It just went underground, like the miners themselves. People still talk about lost claims and hidden fortunes, but they talk quiet-like, as if speaking too loud might wake something better left sleeping. Now, as Caleb searched through Martha's collection, those words took on new significance. Among her notes, he found references to the McAllister family that painted a more complete picture than Thomas's journal alone could provide. Martha had interviewed elderly residents back in the 1980s, recording their stories before those memories disappeared forever. According to these accounts, the McAllister family's disappearance had divided the community. Some residents believed they'd simply moved on to better prospects in California, as many mining families did when their claims played out. But others whispered about violence, about bodies hidden in mine shafts, about powerful men who didn't hesitate to eliminate obstacles to their ambitions. One interview particularly caught Caleb's attention. Mrs. Eleanor Hendricks, who had been a young woman in 1889, told Martha about seeing Thomas McAllister in town just days before his family vanished. He was buying supplies like he was fixing to leave, she'd said, but not supplies for travel, supplies for a fight, ammunition, extra blankets, enough food to last weeks. When I asked if his family was all right, he just looked at me with the saddest eyes and said, "Sometimes a man's got to protect what's his, even if it costs him everything." That interview had been conducted 35 years ago. Mrs. Hendricks was long dead now, and her story would have died with her if Martha hadn't preserved it. But her words suggested that Thomas McAllister hadn't been driven away. He'd made a stand, and that stand had cost him his life and his family's future. The revelation reinforced Caleb's growing understanding that his discovery represented more than personal opportunity. The mine was evidence of a historical injustice, proof that corruption and violence had shaped their community's early development in ways that most residents never suspected. But understanding the past didn't solve the practical problems of the present. Caleb needed help. Someone with expertise in geology and mining, someone who could assess the mine's current value and potential. More importantly, he needed someone he could trust, because the wrong person could destroy his life as easily as the wrong word had destroyed the McAllister family. The answer came from an unexpected source. During his weekly trip to Murphy's Diner for supplies, Caleb overheard a conversation between Jim Henley from the hardware store and Dr. Patricia Wells about the new woman who'd taken over the county assay office. Sarah Chen recently arrived from Colorado with impressive credentials and a reputation for honest dealing. Smart as a whip, Dr. Wells was saying. Got her degree from the Colorado School of Mines, worked for some big operation in Cripple Creek before deciding she wanted a quieter life. Buck Morrison tried to hire her as a private consultant, offered her twice what the county pays, but she turned him down flat. The mention of Morrison's name made Caleb pay closer attention. If the development company owner had tried to hire the new assayer, it suggested that Morrison knew more about the area's mineral potential than his public statements indicated. And if Sarah Chen had refused his offer, it might mean she possessed both the expertise Caleb needed and the integrity to use it honestly. But approaching her would be risky. Any request for assay services would raise questions about what he'd found and where he'd found it. The county assay office wasn't known for discretion, and word of significant mineral deposits would spread through Dry River faster than wildfire. The solution came to him while he was cleaning Rufus's food bowl. Outside the trailer, the dog had been acting strangely for the past few days. Not sick exactly, but restless and anxious in a way that reminded Caleb of his behavior before discovering the sealed passage. Perhaps another visit to Dr. Wells for a routine checkup would provide cover for a casual conversation about the new assayer. Dr. Wells's veterinary clinic occupied a converted house on the edge of town, its waiting room filled with the comfortable chaos of pet owners and their animals. Caleb had been bringing his animals here for 20 years, and Patricia Wells had always treated both him and his pets with respect and genuine care. If anyone in Dry River might be sympathetic to an old man's unusual request, it would be her. "Rufus looks fine to me," Dr. Wells said after a thorough examination. "A little grey around the muzzle, some stiffness in his hips, but nothing unusual. In for a dog his age. What's got you concerned?" Caleb had prepared for this question. "He's been acting different since we moved to the cave. More alert, like he's constantly listening for something. Just wanted to make sure the change of environment wasn't affecting his health." Dr. Wells nodded thoughtfully. "Dogs are sensitive to changes in routine and surroundings. The cave probably has different sounds, smells, maybe even air pressure that he's still adjusting to. Have you noticed anything else unusual about the area?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone suggested more than casual curiosity. Caleb decided to test the waters. "Found some old mining equipment in the back passages. Nothing valuable, just rusty tools and such. Made me wonder about the history of the place." "Interesting." Dr. Wells finished her notes and looked up at him with renewed attention. "You know, Sarah Chen, our new county assayer, mentioned that she'd like to do some historical research on the area's mining activity. Purely academic interest," she said. "Something about how 19th century mining techniques affected the local ecosystem. The opening was perfect, almost too perfect." Caleb wondered if Dr. Wells suspected more than she was saying, but decided to take the risk. "Think she'd be interested in looking at what I found? Nothing dramatic, just curious. About the age of the equipment, I'm sure she would be. Sarah's office is in the county building, but she's usually there afternoons. Very approachable woman, and she seems to appreciate the area's history." As Caleb drove back to Granite Hollow with Rufus beside him in the truck, he felt both excitement and apprehension about the step he was preparing to take. Involving Sarah Chen would end his solitary exploration of the mine's secrets, but it might also provide the expertise he needed to understand what he'd truly discovered. The McAllister family had faced their challenges alone, and that isolation had made them vulnerable to enemies who outnumbered and outmaneuvered them. Caleb didn't intend to repeat their mistake. If Sarah Chen proved trustworthy, he might have found the ally he needed to navigate the dangerous waters ahead. But if she proved otherwise, he might have just signed his own death warrant. The surveyor's transit sat on Sarah Chen's desk, like a brass monument to precision, its intricate system of lenses and calibrated dials, reflecting the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the county building's tall windows. Caleb had carried the antique instrument down from the mine that morning, wrapped carefully in one of Martha's old quilts to protect its delicate mechanisms. "This is remarkable," Sarah said, running her fingers along the instrument's brass fittings, with the reverence of someone who understood both its craftsmanship and its significance. "Late 1880s, probably manufactured in Philadelphia. Whoever used this knew their business. This level of equipment wasn't cheap, even back then." Caleb watched her examine the transit with growing confidence in his decision to approach her. Sarah Chen was younger than he'd expected. Maybe 45, with intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine expertise rather than academic posturing. Her office was organized but not obsessive, with geological charts on the walls and rock samples arranged on shelves with handwritten labels. "Found it in a side passage of the cave," Caleb said, sticking to the careful version of truth he'd prepared. "Along with some other mining equipment. Made me curious about who might have been working up there." Sarah nodded, making notes on a yellow pad. "The level of equipment suggests serious surveying work. Someone was mapping mineral deposits with considerable precision. Do you mind if I ask what else you found?" The question was inevitable, but Caleb had anticipated it. "Old tools, mostly. Some ore samples that might be worth testing. I'm not looking to get rich, just curious about the history of the place. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. The wealth represented by the mine would change his life dramatically, but understanding its history had become almost as important as exploiting its resources." "I'd be happy to do some preliminary testing," Sarah said. "The county has arrangements for historical research that wouldn't cost you anything. And I have to admit, I'm fascinated by the mining history of this area. There are gaps in the historical record that have always puzzled me. Over the next hour, Sarah shared what she knew about 19th century mining operations in the region. Her knowledge was extensive and detailed, covering everything from extraction techniques to the complex web of claims and legal disputes that had characterized the era. But when Caleb mentioned the McAllister family, her expression grew more serious. "That's one of the mysteries I'd like to solve," she said. The McAllister claim was substantial, 3 separate filings covering nearly 200 acres, but the family just vanished, and their claims were eventually awarded to a Denver investment group called Mountain Development Corporation. Very unusual circumstances. Unusual how? Sarah hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. The legal proceedings were rushed, even by 1890s standards. Usually, abandoned claims went through a lengthy process of notification and waiting periods, but the McAllister claims were transferred within weeks of the family's disappearance, and the witness testimony supporting the transfer came from people who had financial connections to Mountain Development. The information confirmed Caleb's suspicions about corruption in the original theft of the mine. But Sarah's knowledge suggested that the historical injustice might be more than just academic interest for her. Did Mountain Development ever work the claims? That's the interesting part. They held the properties for about 5 years, then sold them to local buyers for agricultural use. If the claims contained valuable mineral deposits, it doesn't make sense that they'd give up so easily. Unless, Caleb thought, they'd already extracted what they wanted and covered their tracks, or unless they'd been waiting for better technology or market conditions to make extraction profitable. "Would you be interested in visiting the cave?" he asked, making the invitation he'd been building toward. "Might help you understand what kind of operation was running up there." Sarah's eyes lit up with professional enthusiasm. "I'd love to. See it? When would be convenient?" They arranged to meet the following afternoon, giving Caleb time to prepare the mine for her visit. He would show her enough to demonstrate the site's historical significance without revealing the full extent of what he'd discovered. The surveyor's transit had been perfect for establishing credibility, valuable enough to prove the operation's sophistication, historical enough to justify academic interest, but not so obviously precious that it would raise immediate questions about his motivations. As Caleb drove back to Granite Hollow, he felt cautiously optimistic about the partnership he was developing. Sarah Chen had the expertise he needed, and her interest in historical justice suggested she might be sympathetic to his situation. But he also understood that involving her would accelerate the timeline for decisions about the mine's future. The conversation had also revealed information that changed his understanding of the current situation. If Buck Morrison's company was descended from or connected to the original Mountain Development Corporation, then Morrison's interest in the area might be based on inside knowledge about mineral deposits. The development plans for luxury resorts and golf courses might be cover for renewed mining operations. That evening, as Caleb sat outside the cave entrance with Rufus beside him and the surveyor's transit carefully stored inside, he reflected on the complex web of past and present that seemed to be converging around his discovery. The McAllister family had been destroyed by powerful interests that wanted their gold. Now, more than a century later, those same interests, or their modern equivalents, might be positioning themselves to claim what they'd stolen generations ago. But Caleb had advantages that Thomas McAllister hadn't possessed. He owned the property outright, with clear legal title that couldn't be disputed through the claim system that had made the McAllisters vulnerable. He had potential allies in Sarah Chen and possibly Dr. Wells, and he had the wisdom that came with age and experience, including the hard-won knowledge that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. The surveyor's transit represented more than historical evidence. It symbolized the precision and planning that would be required to protect his discovery from those who would steal it. Just as the instrument had allowed 19th-century miners to map their claims with mathematical accuracy, Caleb would need to map his own strategy with equal care and foresight. The game was becoming more complex, with higher stakes and more in players than he'd initially anticipated. But for the first time since Martha's death, Caleb felt like he was playing to win rather than simply trying to survive. The sheriff's badge lay in Sarah's palm, like a tarnished piece of the past, its six-pointed star barely visible beneath more than a century of corrosion. She had found it clutched in the skeletal fingers of a man whose remains lay in a hidden chamber deep within the mine, a chamber that Caleb had discovered only that morning while showing her the extent of the McAllister operation. "Sheriff Tom McAllister," Sarah read from the badge's engraved surface, her voice barely above a whisper. "This changes everything we thought we knew about what happened here." Caleb knelt beside the skeleton, his flashlight beam illuminating the scene that had stopped both of them cold. The remains were positioned as if the man had crawled into this narrow chamber to hide, or perhaps to die in private. Around the bones, they'd found a leather satchel containing documents that told a story neither of them had expected. He was Thomas's brother, Caleb said, examining the papers that Sarah had carefully extracted from the satchel. According to these letters, he came to investigate after the family disappeared, but instead of finding them, he found the truth about what happened to them. The documents painted a horrifying picture of corruption that reached from the mine shafts to the sheriff's office itself. Tom McAllister had been the legitimate sheriff of the county, but his investigation into his brother's disappearance had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy involving prominent local citizens and Denver businessmen. His own deputies had been bought, his authority undermined, his life threatened when he refused to abandon his inquiry. "Listen to this," Sarah said, reading from a letter dated December 1889. "I've found evidence that Thomas and his family were murdered on the night of November 8th. Their bodies were thrown into the old shaft on the north side of the claim, then dynamited to cover the evidence. The men responsible include Deputy Carson, Merchant William Bradley, and at least 3 others I haven't identified. They're being paid by Mountain Development to eliminate legitimate claim holders and steal their properties." The final entry in Tom McAllister's journal, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, revealed his desperate situation. "They know I've learned the truth. Carson came to the office today with an ultimatum. Leave town by tomorrow or face the same fate as Thomas. But I can't abandon my brother's family to this injustice. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find this evidence and see. Justice done. Someone had found it, but justice was still waiting after more than 130 years. This explains why the legal transfer of the claims was so rushed," Sarah said, carefully photographing each document with her phone. "They needed to establish ownership before anyone could investigate the family's disappearance too closely, and having the sheriff eliminated removed the only person with authority to challenge their actions." Caleb felt sick as the full scope of the historical crime became clear. The McAllister family hadn't just been claim-jumped. They'd been murdered in cold blood by a conspiracy that included law enforcement officials who should have protected them. Their children, if they'd survived the initial attack, had been left orphaned and homeless, their inheritance stolen by the very people trusted to uphold the law. But the implications for the present situation were equally disturbing. "Sarah," Caleb said slowly, "what do you know about the current sheriff's family history?" She looked up from the documents, her expression troubled. "Sheriff Bradley? He's been in office for 12 years. His family's been in the area for generations." She paused, the connection becoming clear. "Bradley, like William Bradley, the merchant mentioned in these papers. His great-great-grandfather, probably. And Buck Morrison's development company could be connected to the original Mountain Development Corporation," Sarah finished. "We need to research the corporate lineage, but if there's a direct connection, It would explain Morrison's knowledge about mineral deposits in the area. The revelation transformed their understanding of the current situation. Morrison's development plans might not be about building resorts at all, but about accessing mineral rights that his ancestors had stolen through murder. And if Sheriff Bradley was descended from one of the original conspirators, then legal protection for Caleb's claim might be impossible to obtain through local authorities. "We can't trust anyone in the current power structure," Caleb said, voicing what they both understood. If this conspiracy has been passed down through generations, then the same families that committed murder in 1889 might be willing to commit murder in 2025. Sarah nodded grimly. "But we have advantages they didn't have back then. Federal oversight, modern communication, forensic evidence that can prove the historical crimes. The question is how to use those advantages before they realize what we've discovered." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of vehicles approaching the cave entrance reached them through the mine's tunnels. Caleb's blood ran cold as he recognized the distinctive rumble of Morrison's pickup truck, accompanied by at least 2 other vehicles. Through the cave entrance, he could see dust clouds rising from the access road he'd carved through the forest. "They've found us," he whispered to Sarah, extinguishing his flashlight and motioning for her to do the same. In the sudden darkness of the chamber, they could hear voices echoing from the main cave entrance, men calling Caleb's name with a false friendliness that fooled no one. "Caleb Boone!" Morrison's voice carried clearly through the tunnels. "Know you're in there, old man. Time we had ourselves a talk about that property of yours." Sarah gripped Caleb's arm, her voice barely audible. "Is there another way out?" Caleb thought frantically about the mine's layout. Most of the passages ended in solid rock or unsafe areas prone to collapse. But there was one possibility, a chimney shaft that Thomas McAllister had carved as an escape route, probably in response to the same kind of threats they now faced. "Maybe," he whispered, "but it's dangerous, and I don't know if we can make it with the evidence." "The evidence is more important than we are," Sarah replied, carefully sealing the documents back into their protective containers. "This is proof of multiple murders and a conspiracy that's lasted more than a century. If we don't survive to get this to federal authorities, justice will never be done." The voices were getting closer, and Caleb could hear the sound of flashlights clicking on as Morrison's men entered the mine tunnels. Soon they would discover the passage to the deeper chambers, and then escape would become impossible. Rufus pressed against Caleb's leg, the dog's loyalty unchanged despite the danger. In that moment, Caleb understood that his choice was the same. When Tom McAllister had faced more than a century ago, abandon the evidence and live as a coward, or risk everything for the chance to see justice done. But unlike Tom McAllister, Caleb wasn't facing this choice alone. He had Sarah's expertise, Rufus's loyalty, and the advantage of knowing exactly who his enemies were and what they were capable of. "Follow me," he whispered, leading Sarah toward the narrow shaft that might be their only hope of survival. "And pray that shaft hasn't collapsed in the last 130 years. Behind them, Morrison's voice echoed through the tunnels with increasing menace. "We know you found something valuable up here, Boone. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Martha's wedding quilt lay spread across the kitchen table in Sarah. Jen's small house on the outskirts of Dry River, its intricate pattern of interlocking rings serving as the foundation for their desperate planning session. They had escaped the mine through Tom McAllister's emergency shaft, emerging 300 yards away in a tangle of brush and fallen timber that had concealed the exit for more than a century. Now, 12 hours later, they were using the quilt as both a map and a signal system for the most important gamble of their lives. "The red squares represent safe houses," Sarah explained, marking locations on the quilt with small safety pins. "People we can trust absolutely. The blue squares, or potential allies, folks who might help if they understand what's at stake." And the black squares, she pointed to several pins scattered across the quilt's border. Those are Morrison's people, or folks we know we can't trust. Caleb studied the pattern, recognizing addresses and landmarks disguised within Martha's careful needlework. His late wife had always been clever with hidden meanings, embedding family stories and local history into her quilts in ways that only those who knew her well could decipher. Now, her final quilt was serving as a tactical map for a battle she, who could never have anticipated. Dr. Wells is definitely red, Sarah continued, placing a pin near the quilt's center. She's already suspicious about Morrison's activities, and she has connections throughout the county. The retired mining engineer, Frank Rodriguez, he's red too, lives up on Timber Ridge, has his own beef with development companies. What about the federal authorities? Caleb asked, examining the evidence they'd smuggled out of the mine. Tom McAllister's badge, the original documents, photographs of the crime scene, everything they needed to prove the historical murders and expose the current conspiracy. I've been in contact with the FBI's Denver field office and the Bureau of Land Management, Sarah replied. They're interested, but federal bureaucracy moves slowly. They want to send investigators next week to examine the evidence and interview witnesses. That gives Morrison at least 5 days to eliminate us and destroy the mine. 5 days might as well be 5 years, Caleb thought grimly. Morrison had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence, and the discovery that Sheriff Bradley couldn't be trusted meant they had no local law enforcement protection. Worse, Morrison's men had surely found evidence of their escape route by now, which meant their current hideout was temporary at best. We need to force Morrison's hand, Caleb said, voicing the conclusion that had been building in his mind since their escape. Make him act openly, where witnesses can see what he's really doing. Sarah looked up from the quilt with concern. That's incredibly dangerous. If Morrison feels cornered, he might decide that eliminating witnesses is his only option. These people have been covering up murders for over a century. What's a few more bodies to them? Maybe, Caleb acknowledged. But right now, we're playing their game, hiding and running while they control the narrative. We need to change the rules, make this public before they can spin it their way. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. They would return to the mine openly during daylight hours, with as many witnesses as possible. Sarah would contact the press, the State Geological Survey, anyone who might be interested in a significant archaeological discovery. Meanwhile, Caleb would reach out to the small network of people who had known and respected Martha, asking them to serve as observers and witnesses to whatever happened next. The key is timing, Sarah explained, using Martha's quilt to illustrate the coordination required. We need everyone to arrive at roughly the same time before Morrison can isolate us or control access to the site. If we can get enough people up there, including reporters and state officials, he won't dare use violence openly. And if we can't? Sarah's expression was grim but determined. Then we make sure the evidence gets to federal authorities, even if we don't survive to testify. I've already uploaded everything to secure servers with instructions for automatic release if I don't check in every 12 hours. The rest of the day was spent in careful preparation. Sarah used her professional contacts to generate interest in what she described as a significant historical discovery with implications for land use and mineral rights. Caleb made phone calls to people who had known Martha, explaining that he'd found something she would have wanted them to see, something that honored the memory of families who had been wronged. Dr. Patricia Wells was the first to commit to attending. Martha always said this valley held secrets that needed telling, she said over the phone. If you found something that important, I'll be there. Frank Rodriguez, the retired mining engineer, was equally supportive. Been wondering about that area for 40 years, he admitted. Geological surveys never made sense for the mineral, content that was supposed to be there. Time somebody took a proper look. By evening, they had commitments from 12 people to meet at the mine the following afternoon. journalists from 2 regional newspapers, a state archaeologist, 3 members of the County Historical Society, and several long-time residents who remembered Martha's historical research. It wasn't an army, but it might be enough witnesses to prevent outright violence. The most difficult call was to Buck Morrison himself. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, using her office phone to make the contact seem official. "This is Sarah Chen from the County Assay Office. I'm calling to inform you about a significant historical discovery on property adjacent to your development plans. As a courtesy to major landowners in the area, I wanted to invite you to attend a presentation tomorrow afternoon." Morrison's response was immediate and suspicious. "What kind of discovery? And why wasn't I contacted earlier if this affects my property?" "It's related to 19th century mining operations and may have implications for mineral rights in the area. The presentation is at 2 p.m. at the Granite Hollow site. I'm sure a businessman of your stature would want to understand any factors that might affect future development." There was a long pause before Morrison replied. "I'll be there, and I'll be bringing my legal representatives to ensure my interests are protected." After Sarah hung up, she and Caleb sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that they had just committed themselves to a confrontation that would determine not only their own fates, but the resolution of an injustice that had festered for more than a century. "You sure about this?" Caleb asked, touching the corner of Martha's quilt where a ring pattern seemed to glow in the lamplight. "We could still turn everything over to the FBI and let them handle it, and watch Morrison destroy the evidence while federal investigators spend months processing paperwork." Sarah shook her head. "Tom McAllister died trying to get justice for his brother's family. We owe it to him and to them to finish what he started." Caleb nodded, drawing strength from the memory of Martha's unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. She had taught Sunday school for 30 years, not because it was easy or profitable, but because she believed children deserved moral guidance. She had organized community service projects not for recognition, but because neighbors should help neighbors. And she had spent countless hours researching local history, not for academic acclaim, but because she believed the truth mattered. Now her quilt was serving as the battle plan for a fight she would have supported completely, a struggle between justice and corruption that would determine whether the McAllister family's sacrifice had any lasting meaning. As they prepared for sleep in Sarah's guest room, Rufus curled up beside Caleb's bed like a guardian against the darkness. The old dog seemed to understand that tomorrow would bring danger, but his presence was steady and reassuring. Whatever happened at the mine, Caleb wouldn't face it alone. Outside, a cold wind rattled the windows and set the autumn leaves dancing, in patterns that reminded Caleb of Martha's quilt rings, circles of connection that bound past to present, justice to memory, love to the courage required to defend it. Tomorrow, one way or another, the long wait for justice would finally end. The dynamite cache sat in its original wooden crate like sleeping thunder, each stick wrapped in waxy paper that had somehow survived more than a century in the mine's dry air. Caleb had discovered it during his final survey of the mine's defenses, hidden in an alcove that Thomas McAllister had prepared for exactly the kind of confrontation that was about to unfold. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was preparing to use the long-dead miner's own explosives to protect the mine from the same families that had murdered Thomas and his children. The dynamite represented more than defensive capability. It was the power of truth itself, explosive and dangerous to those who would suppress it. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said for the 3rd time that morning as they positioned the charges at strategic points throughout the mine complex. "We have enough witnesses coming. Morrison won't dare try anything violent with reporters and state officials present." Caleb continued his work, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was preparing. Morrison's family has been getting away with murder for over 130 years. You think they'll stop now when they're this close to claiming the biggest prize of all? At 1:30 p.m., the first vehicles began arriving at the mine site. Dr. Wells drove up in her veterinary van, followed by Frank Rodriguez in a battered pickup truck that had seen decades of mountain roads. The journalists came next. A young woman from the Denver Post and a grizzled veteran from the local paper who remembered Martha's historical articles. By 2 p.m., 12 people had gathered at the cave entrance, creating exactly the kind of public witness situation that Caleb and Sarah had hoped for. The state archaeologist was documenting everything with professional photographs, while the Historical Society members examined the 19th century mining equipment with obvious excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, standing before the assembled group with Tom McAllister's badge glinting in the afternoon sunlight, "what you're about to see represents one of the most significant historical discoveries in Colorado mining history, and possibly one of the most important unsolved crimes of the territorial period." That's when Buck Morrison arrived. His convoy of 3 black SUVs roared up the mountain road like invading vehicles, disgorging 8 men in dark clothing, who positioned themselves around the cave entrance with military precision. Morrison himself stepped out of the lead vehicle wearing an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in the mountain wilderness, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. "This gathering is trespassing on private property," he announced, loudly, striding toward the group with his men flanking him. "I'm ordering all of you to leave immediately or face criminal prosecution." The journalists immediately began taking photographs and video, while Dr. Wells stepped forward with the calm authority of someone who had dealt with aggressive behavior for decades. "Mr. Morrison, this is a lawful archaeological investigation. On property owned by Mr. Boone, you have no authority to order anyone to leave." "We'll see about that," Morrison snarled, pulling out his phone. "Sheriff Bradley, this is Buck Morrison. I need you at the Granite Hollow site immediately. We have a situation involving trespassers and possible theft of mineral resources." Caleb felt his blood run cold. If Sheriff Bradley arrived with deputies, the situation would shift dramatically in Morrison's favor. Local law enforcement could order the witnesses to leave, control access to the evidence, and give Morrison's men the cover they needed to eliminate the threat to their century-old conspiracy. "Sarah," he said quietly, "time to show them what we found." Sarah nodded and began leading the group toward the mine entrance. But Morrison's men moved to block their path. The confrontation was escalating exactly as Caleb had feared. Witnesses or no witnesses, Morrison was prepared to use force to protect his family's secret. "Nobody goes into that cave," one of Morrison's men announced, his hand resting meaningfully on a concealed weapon. "This is private business." Frank Rodriguez, despite being in his 70s, stepped forward with the confidence of a man who had faced down dangerous situations in mines around the world. "Son, I've been examining mineral deposits since before you were born. If there's something in that cave worth killing for, then it's something worth dying for too." The standoff stretched taut as a wire, 12 unarmed civilians facing 8 armed men, while the truth of a 130-year-old murder lay waiting in the darkness behind them. In that moment, Caleb realized that all their careful planning had led to this inevitable point. The same choice that Thomas McAllister and his brother Tom had faced more than a century ago: fight for justice and risk everything, or surrender to corruption and let evil triumph. Rufus pressed against Caleb's leg, the old dog's loyalty unwavering even in the face of mortal danger. The dynamite charges were positioned. The detonator was in Caleb's pocket, and the evidence of historical murder was documented and uploaded to servers beyond Morrison's reach. "Mr. Morrison," Caleb said, his voice carrying across the mountain, hollow with surprising strength, "your great-great-grandfather was a murderer, and you're about to repeat his crimes. But this time, the whole world is watching. The original mining claim document emerged from its protective case like a ghost made manifest, its faded ink and official seals still clearly visible despite more than 130 years of hiding. Sarah held it up where everyone could see. The afternoon sunlight, making the territorial government's watermark shimmer with legal authority that transcended time itself. Thomas McAllister's original filing, she announced to the assembled witnesses, her voice carrying clearly across the mountain. Arlo, dated March 15th, 1889, and witnessed by Territorial Judge Harrison Webb. This document establishes legal ownership of this entire area, including mineral rights that were never legitimately transferred. Morrison's face went white as he recognized the implications. "That's a forgery," he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "No document could have survived that long in good condition." "The forensic analysis will prove its authenticity," Sarah replied calmly. "But more importantly, we found it alongside evidence of the murders that your ancestor committed to steal this claim." That's when Sheriff Bradley's vehicles came roaring up the mountain road, their sirens wailing and emergency lights flashing. 3 patrol cars and an SUV created a cloud of dust as they skidded to a stop, disgorging 6 deputies who immediately positioned themselves in support of Morrison's men. "What's the situation here?" Sheriff Bradley demanded as he strode toward the group, his hand resting on his service weapon. He was a big man with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from years of unchallenged authority. But Caleb could see the family resemblance to the corrupt merchant described in Tom McAllister's journal. "Trespassing and theft of mineral resources," Morrison said quickly. "These people are on private property making false claims about historical ownership." "Our property belongs to Mr. Boone," Dr. Wells interjected, but Bradley waved her silent with obvious disdain. "I'll decide what's legal and what isn't," the sheriff said. "Right now I'm ordering everyone except Mr. Morrison and his representatives to leave this area immediately." "Sheriff Bradley," Sarah said, stepping forward with Tom McAllister's badge in her palm, "before you make any decisions, you should know that we've discovered the remains of your ancestor's first victim." Bradley's expression shifted from authority to confusion to something that might have been fear. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Sheriff Tom McAllister, murdered in December 1889 while investigating the deaths of his brother Thomas and his family. We found his body in the mine, along with evidence that your great-great-grandfather William Bradley was part of the conspiracy that killed them." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of cameras clicking as the journalist documented every word and gesture. Caleb could see the calculation in Bradley's eyes. How much did they really know? How much could be proven? How much damage control was still possible? "Even if that's true," Bradley said finally, "it has nothing to do with current law enforcement. I'm ordering this area cleared for public safety reasons." "Actually, Sheriff, it has everything to do with current law enforcement," said a new voice from behind the group. Everyone turned to see 3 people in FBI windbreakers walking up the mountain path, led by a woman with short gray hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of federal investigation experience. "Special Agent Maria Santos, FBI Denver Field Office," the woman announced, displaying her credentials. "We received some very interesting evidence uploads last night, along with allegations of historical murder and ongoing corruption. We're here to secure the crime scene and interview witnesses." Morrison's men shifted nervously, their earlier confidence evaporating as federal authority superseded local jurisdiction. Sheriff Bradley's face went through several shades of red as he realized that his family's 130-year-old secret was about to become a federal case. "This is harassment," Morrison protested, but his voice cracked with desperation. "You can't prove anything based on century-old allegations." "Actually, we can," Agent Santos replied, accepting the mining claim document from Sarah with professional care. "Forensic archaeology has come a long way since 1889. And when we combine physical evidence with documented confessions and witness testimony, historical prosecutions become very possible." Caleb felt a surge of vindication as he watched. Morrison and Bradley realized that their generational conspiracy was finally unraveling. The federal agents were photographing everything, interviewing witnesses, and treating the mine as an active crime scene despite the crimes being more than a century old. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Santos approached Caleb directly. "Mr. Boone, I understand you're the legal owner of this property and the person who discovered the evidence. We'll need your full cooperation with our investigation, but I want you to know that the federal government recognizes your legitimate claim to these mineral rights." Rufus wagged his tail as if he understood that justice had finally arrived, while Morrison and his men found themselves surrounded by federal agents who were very interested in their weapons, their presence at the scene, and their family histories. The mining claim document had done more than establish ownership. It had established truth, accountability, and the principle that some crimes were too important to remain buried forever. The new headstone rose from Martha's grave like a monument to love transcendent, its surface carved from the gold-veined quartz that had been at the heart of the McAllister mine. In the 6 months since the confrontation at Granite Hollow, Caleb had learned that some treasures were worth more than the precious metals they contained, and some victories were measured not in dollars, but in dignity restored. "She would have loved this," Dr. Patricia Wells said, running her fingers along the intricate carving that depicted intertwined wedding rings surrounded by mountain peaks. "Martha always said that the most beautiful stones were the ones that had been through the most pressure." Caleb nodded, adjusting the collar around Rufus's neck, still bearing Martha's name after all these years, but now accompanied by a small gold tag that read, "Guardian of Truth." The old dog had become something of a celebrity after the story broke in newspapers across the country, but he seemed to take the attention in stride, more interested in the steady routine of their new life than in the occasional photographer, who still showed up at the mine. The McAllister Historical Foundation occupied a restored building in downtown Dry River, its exhibits telling the complete story of the murdered family and the century-long cover-up that had hidden their fate. Sarah Chen had accepted the position as executive director with enthusiasm, transforming her expertise in geology into a broader mission of historical education and justice advocacy. The forensic archaeology team finished their work last week. Sarah reported, joining Caleb and Dr. Wells at Martha's graveside. They've confirmed the identities of all 5 victims: Thomas, his wife Catherine, their children Mary and James, and Sheriff Tom McAllister. The physical evidence supports everything we found in the documents, including the cause of death and the timeline of the murders. The federal investigation had been swift and thorough. Buck Morrison was facing federal charges for conspiracy, witness intimidation, and attempted destruction of evidence, while Sheriff Bradley had been removed from office pending investigation into his department's corruption and his family's historical involvement in the crimes. The Mountain Development Corporation's assets had been frozen, and its attempts to claim mineral rights in the area had been permanently blocked by federal court order. But for Caleb, the most important outcome had been the quiet transformation of his own life and his relationship with the community that had once dismissed him as a foolish old man. The mine itself had been converted into a memorial and educational center rather than a commercial operation. While geological surveys had confirmed that the gold deposits were indeed worth the estimated $137 million, Caleb had chosen to establish a trust that would preserve the site as a monument to historical justice while providing ongoing support for educational programs and victim advocacy. "I've had enough of being poor," he had told the lawyers handling the trust establishment, "but I've never been interested in being rich. There's a difference between having enough and having too much, and Martha taught me where that line should be drawn." His modest new house sat on a hill overlooking the mine site, close enough that he could walk to work each morning as the Foundation's chief historical consultant, but far enough that he could enjoy the peace and quiet that had drawn him to Granite Hollow in the first place. Rufus had claimed the front porch as his domain, greeting visitors with the dignity of a dog who understood his important role in the story. The town's attitude toward Caleb had undergone a complete reversal. Where once he had been the subject of pitying whispers and dismissive jokes, he was now recognized as the man who had exposed one of the most significant historical crimes in Colorado's territorial period. Children studying local history learned about his courage in facing down armed men to protect evidence of murder. Adults who had once avoided him now sought his opinions on matters ranging from land development to historical preservation. The high school wants to name their new library after Martha, Dr. Wells mentioned, watching as Caleb placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the headstone. They're hoping you'll speak at the dedication ceremony. Martha would like that, Caleb replied, his voice warm with the contentment that had replaced the bitterness of his earlier isolation. She always said that education was the best investment a community could make. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, Caleb reflected on the journey that had brought him from town, fool to respected elder. The cave trade that everyone had mocked as senile foolishness had led to the discovery of historical murder, the exposure of generational corruption, and the restoration of justice for a family that had been forgotten by everyone except the people who had killed them. More importantly, it had restored his own sense of purpose and dignity. The man who had once felt invisible and worthless now woke each morning with meaningful work to do, important stories to tell, and the respect of a community that had learned not to judge by appearances or assumptions. The McAllister family's story was being told in schools and museums across the state. Their tragedy transformed into a lesson about the importance of standing up for justice, even when the cost seemed unbearable. Sheriff Tom McAllister's badge was displayed in the Foundation's main exhibit, alongside the mining equipment, family photographs, and legal documents that proved their innocence and their killer's guilt. But perhaps the most meaningful exhibit was a simple display case containing Martha's recipe box, opened to show the historical notes and newspaper clippings that had helped solve the mystery. Visitors learned that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from professional researchers or official investigations, but from ordinary people who cared enough to preserve stories that others might ignore or forget. As Caleb and Rufus walked down the mountain path toward home, the old dog moving with the careful dignity of advancing years, but still alert to every sound and scent, Caleb felt grateful for the choices that had brought them to this peaceful conclusion. The cave that everyone had thought worthless had contained the most valuable treasure of all, the truth that could heal old wounds and restore faith in the possibility of justice. In the distance, the mine site glowed in the setting sun, no longer a place of hidden secrets, but a monument to the power of ordinary people to uncover extraordinary truths and transform them into lasting change.